All right, fine, we'll do it live. Oh, hey, welcome to the Spin Room, where it's all spin all the time. Our guest now is Erik Ghenoiu, who's here for our Conspiracy Hour. Erik is a historian and faculty at SCI-Arc, and I like to think of him as kind of like my Uncle Fred of architecture, someone who is a basement historian of sorts, drawing red lines between ideas and histories of architecture. So, right now, welcome Erik Ghenoiu.
Come around to the middle. So,
Erik, thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
So for today's discussion, we're going to be looking at the kind of history of architecture as a place where camps and ideologies and formations have carved out these contours that shape what we see today at Thesis. And so, thinking about history in these terms. Have you been able to recently identify any good conspiracies that maybe have been taking place right under our nose over the last however long?
Of course, there's constantly theories, different kind of conspiracies going on around us. I think we've seen at least 3 attempts to take over architecture in the last 5 years, all of which have failed, but it just means no one's running the show. Around here at Thesis, I think we're seeing basically 2 different kinds of conspiracies in action. There's the conspiracy that we're programming into the students on purpose and for our own ends, of which there are 2 competing kinds, battling it out to win the hearts and minds. But then there seems to be a conspiracy among the students because when we all show up to see what they've done in the last little push when they put the final things up, we always see strains happening that we didn't anticipate. And there's like why is everybody doing Hayduk this year? Who taught them this? And we ask ourselves, and nobody knows where they got it and what they're doing. So they clearly are running some conspiracies of their own. So yeah, I think we might be able to try to find a couple threads, but right now it's too early to say. I think tomorrow we'll know better what the conspiracies really were this year.
I think that for this part of the segment, it'd be helpful to get some insight from some other historian conspiracists. We have with us Michael Osman, faculty at UCLA, historian, and Mariana Mogilevich, who is a journalist, editor of Urban Omnibus, and historian as well. Welcome to the Spin Room.
Do I need to turn this on? It's on. It's on. It's already on.
All right.
It's been on.
Totally hotwired.
So, welcome to the Spin Room. How do you think that conspiracies have played out through architectural history, Michael? Is it something that you've been noticing and thinking about in your basement and your garage over the last 20 years?
My office is in a basement. I don't know what that means, but I don't really. I'm neurotic, but I'm not a conspiracy theorist by any measure. I also think that probably architectural theory itself is something like, for 10 years or so, seems to be something that I just haven't seen much of. So if a replacement for that might be a conspiracy theory, I think there's probably good reason for that. Which is to say, I think that we've had a kind of dry period of a lack of theorization, and it would be really, I'd welcome it. I'm a little worried about the incoming flood of conspiracy theory, especially after reading like the El Paso shooters manifesto, because that's clearly neurotic to the point of annihilation. So yeah, things like that. I do think conspiracy theories are unfortunately invading and maybe overtaking political discourse, and I'm imagining that soon we'll see that if we haven't already seen it in architecture.
That seems like it would put a great onus on architectural historians to try to debunk the fake news, misinformation, and sort of invented stories of such conspiracy theories to try to lead us all to some kind of realm of fact, which seems like a very tall order for some humble historians in the future.
Well, you guys seem like you're trying to stand above the fray, but would you say that it is absolutely not true that there are people in positions of power in architecture who have an agenda to try to force it to be one thing and not the other things that it might be right now?
Yes.
For sure, right? For sure, there are. There's actually multiple groups of them that we know about, and there's probably other quiet ones that we don't hear about as much. But like that's clearly happening constantly, right?
You mean like cabals?
Cabals in architecture, yeah. And there's cabals in that architectural academia. It's maybe the place where it's easiest to form a cabal. Yeah. But there's certainly cabals in practice. There's cabals between architects and some of the developers and clients who work with them. And there's probably cabals that work between governments and architects, right? I think of like, why did all the architecture in Berlin turn out the way it did in the 90s, early 2000s? It was because of a cabal led by Kleihues and Kohlhoff in collaboration with people in the city administration to keep other kinds of architecture out, right? Hugely effective cabal. That is not even a conspiracy. They were brazen about it. But I think we see these kind of things happening all the time around us. And I think if there's anyone that I can think of trying to kind of quietly build support, the kind of Gulen of architecture would be you, Michael.
I mean, what is it? What was the Henry Ford conspiracy theory about the elders of Zion? This is why I have a negative emotion when I am associated with that. So I do think that a word that you might replace cabal or conspiracy with would be collaboration. And and now as a way of like maybe reducing the negative political valence of conspiracy or cabal and trying to maybe replace that with a positive sense of a kind of new repertoire of shared values and community building among historians and architects, among architects and developers. I think we could begin to say, give it a positive valence and say, actually, it'd be really nice to hear something from the architects' collaborative, as it were, reconstituted, and think about what it would mean to have, let's say, a design discourse again.
Right.
Theory, say, even.
Yeah, like maybe rereading collaboration as conspiracy can be a productive topic if we think about it as collaboration. Like, how would the grays read the whites as the whites as a collaboration or a kind of coordinated effort to influence people's minds in architecture and in a specific way.
Right. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, no, I mean, just quickly, isn't it all about the end game, right? If it's towards nefarious means, you're conspiring. If it's towards a bright new future, then it's a happy collaboration.
But judged by who? Everyone always believes their own version is the bright new future.
I believe that.
Yeah.
Which is why in a way, it's a slightly ironic reading of history, but it's, I think, meant to provoke a kind of fragmentation of camps, where today anything goes, everybody agrees with each other, it's all kind of nice, nothing matters. And then it's sort of a rereading of the landscape to say, like, those three projects are in a clear lineage, not only with themselves, but also with architecture history. You know, what are they trying to accomplish? And what are we trying to accomplish?
Just the whites and grays, I think that I wouldn't see those as camps. I'd see those as one giant collaboration among a bunch of formalists. And I think that they were making a false dichotomy. And that was what they called design discourse then. And I think that's a really good example of a kind of collaboration without real nefarious goals, except for gaining somehow media attention. Getting maybe like an exhibition at the MoMA, or hijacking the UCLA like auditorium for an afternoon.
Wait, so you were saying that there's nothing nefarious about Peter Eisenman in the 70s?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I love
So
Peter
now
Eisenman.
we know you're just putting
He knows I love him.
Well, I'm thinking about this topic you bring up about the positive impacts of brainwashing. And I think about it in terms of a kind of agenda that I think, if people have an agenda now that they're trying to kind of create a consensus by like luring the young into believing what they believe, which is what I mean when I say I see you as a conspiracy leader. I think all the there's different kinds of teachers, but I think that most of the conspiracies I can see right now stem from that anxiety about the weakening of the visibility of the discourse, but also a kind of feeling that the constitution of what made sense to do in the field doesn't really hold anymore. Like that somehow some of the assumptions don't make sense anymore, and we're obliged to think through a new way. Like, of course, that's what a lot of people who held, stage coups said, over the years. But I think that's how I would kind of characterize what I think is like when I would kind of say that you're trying to do this systematically. That it's about that, right? It's like trying to say like, no, we have to throw out all of this stuff. There's a whole branches of what we do and what we bend that no longer make any sense, and trying to understand what makes sense becomes the kind of basis of trying to move forward at all in the discourse. Fair?
About me,
yeah. So yeah.
My feeling is that I am part of a group of historians that have been accused of being a cabal called Aggregate, and among that membership, there are people who argue that there are, you might call them epistemologies, if you want to be irritatingly erudite, or you could just call them kind of like a period mentality or something like that. That was never really fully substantiated and has been running things in our field for about 100 years or so. So I'm just thinking of a recent book called Kinesthetic Knowing by Zeynep Çelik-Alexander. It basically exposes that design knowledge was an invention at the end of the 19th century of a bunch of German psychologists, and that this has become the sort of basis from which we produced, great-grandfathers, all great-grandfathers, white grandfathers, produced formalist design education. And that's where the pedagogy comes from, and then the question becomes, do those values align with our values 100 years later, or have we outgrown that epistemic condition? And I agree with her that it's exhausted and it's exhausting, but I don't know if I have the solution, but I'm working on one collaboratively.
Okay, so there's clearly a kind of strategy that's been at play within a reevaluation of the formal approach of design knowledge within itself. I think that what we've seen maybe in the last 25 years was the rise of a kind of like, almost slightly, and maybe it's too much to call it anti-design, but kind of indifferent to the contortions within design discourse approach that insisted on a kind of political, urban engagement with the experience real and maybe like a traditional version of what constitutes the real, and that one was kind of like defined as like these are the things that really matter. A lot of this other stuff is actually just navel gazing, and this is the kind of conspiracy that I would say I would align you with, Mariana.
That seems like an absolutely fair characterization. Guilty as charged.
And you don't try to sell your wares to the field of architecture within its own like discourse either. Like the audience that you shoot for is a broader one. Would you say that's fair?
I think that is fair.
Mm-hmm.
I think, the hope, the maybe self-righteous and hopeless hope would be that designers as well would think to look at their work from the outside in, and that this would create a new consciousness that would probably end up being paralyzing and unhelpful. But yes, the sort of work of translation it would be very helpful if others could sort of understand what you were trying to do, but it would also be very helpful if you could understand how others understand what you think you're trying to do. At the end of the day, perhaps that is about trying to forge some larger collaboration, right? If people can speak across and without the disciplinary languages that are so helpful on the one hand to, reinforce a particular sort of domain of education and action, but one could say end up being very damaging for the ability to bring that work to bear on the world. I guess I just want everyone to be able to talk to each other.
Talking to each other is certainly part of conspiracy. One thing that you brought up earlier was the sort of outside of the let's say the discursive circle, the conspiracy between maybe architects and clients and developers. And I'm starting to think about the way that maybe projects become politicized. Things like the Shed recently was criticized for housing the wrong event, and architecture somehow becomes implicated in these things, whether or not it wants to be. And also the High Line.
You criticized it.
I was reporting on criticism of it.
Objective
Yeah,
reportage.
yeah, just like what the Twitter is saying, but also something like the High Line becomes wrapped up in this whole discourse. I know that Dylan's Video also Renfro, their project in Moscow also has been championed by the government as this kind of like great accomplishment. So in that sense, I think these things do maybe cut even further across boundaries. Like there's these people at KPF making these large master planned neighborhoods, and they don't learn that by themselves. They learn it through managerial consultants like McKinsey and these kind of larger forces that make cities. So I was wondering, maybe you mentioned earlier the geopolitical aesthetic. How do these kind of like, let's say like, I think of it kind of as the donor class, but that might be a little bit too cultural. Maybe it's more like the kind of international geopolitical class of actors. How do you think that kind of power structure maybe is acting as a conspiracy or not?
I did read that this morning because I'm a good student and I didn't know what conspiracy meant. And Jameson says that it's the rhetorical form, the narrative allegorical form of a geopolitical moment, which is to say that at the moment that we understand the globe to be a totality and everything turns into conspiracy because all objects become tools for communication. So actually, it's a refusal of a kind of high-low discourse, for example. The El Paso shooters conspiracy theory builds on the Christchurch conspiracy theory, which then has no legitimacy in my mind, but in a kind of collective consciousness it distributes without any need for fact, without any need for truth, without any need for knowledge. It's just a theory, and it's as valid as any other. I think that is a result of what Jameson is saying, the sort of total sort of internalization of the world into a communication medium. that's an artifact of that. Which is to say, I don't think like a managerial consultant coming to KPF from McKinsey is an elite anymore, has any more power immediately than like a group of, you know, a couple million people who patrol the borders making horrible statements about people seeking refuge in the United States. So like, I think the idea of like a mid-century, mid-20th century idea that there were like elites who, you know, the power elite, you know, like C. Wright Mills or something, and that there's everyone else. I think we're seeing the erosion of that, and there's a new kind of base of power that's emerging, and so. Yeah, I really worry about that. Not that I felt more secure when McKinsey was in charge, but a little less racist, maybe a little, just slightly.
We can see like maybe the refreshing change that there's like the idea that there was a kind of well-considered, thought-through, like secret power structure that was operating things becomes like. Both politically and within, and like larger than architecture, and then within architecture, we can see that whoa, the seemingly smart like system that was supposed to be working under the surface wasn't even there anymore, and like oh good God, there's not any system. Like that seems to be kind of refreshingly clear. Maybe to try to put a positive spin on it in here, but I would say then, in light of that, can we ask like maybe while we still have a little bit of time, what about what the students are doing in reviews right here? Because they don't buy into the old divides and the battles that like we didn't go through that long ago, but we were picking sides in fights that were pretty clear, and we knew where they were inherited from. And I think going around like through the halls here, they will freely mix the two, the kind of formalist battle and the kind of urban reaching out to the people battle. Like they are together in a number of these projects. Like they just don't care, or they don't recognize that there's like a long lineage of reasons why this is a fundamental problem, because they didn't, I mean, maybe we just didn't teach them about it, but like maybe that's serving them well? I don't know, what do you think?
Well, I mean, speaking from the few projects that I've seen, you know, perhaps bringing it back to, oh, were we better off when, you know, the experts were running things? I think it does raise the question of when you try to do both, what kind of tools do you actually have to do one or the other to a sufficient degree of resolution and truthfulness? And I can't believe I keep using words like accuracy, right, or sort of facts, but I don't know. I do think that raises a question if you sort of move beyond one or the other, what do students need to know to do the kind of work that they want to do? What is urban research, you know, who the hell knows? But we do actually need to figure out what is the urbanism that architecture students need to understand in order to sort of convincingly address the questions that they're interested in addressing, I would say.
Yeah,
that was not very conspiratorial.
Well, but as they start to scale up, I think we see like climate refugees coming. I mean, these questions. Yeah, I mean, I think this would make a great place to have some refuge, have some beds here. These questions, I think, as they scale up, become more and more pertinent, because you're going to start to see these machinations of maybe, like as you were mentioning, like nationalism and these things that are not in the traditional sense even. Like these questions are going to be amplified to the point where they become much more complicated, and it'll be interesting to see how we design these places, because they might be a larger scale, but these places still implicate architecture, I think.
I mean, I think that it is our responsibility to produce a group of educated adults who can manage the future of things like climate change, which used to be called global warming, maybe more accurately, and you know, people who can manage emerging nationalisms as part of the let's say the skill set of entering into the real world, as it were, as a professional architect. I think it's our responsibility.
So you buy into the kind of expansion of the first American academic system to kind of put in this kind of meritocratic, highly educated elite class that we're supposed to manage everything on behalf of everyone else. Like that, you think it's our responsibility to still create that class. The way that we were actually trained was through a system, a very, very huge and expensive system at very specific places to do that.
I could quit or do that. I prefer not to quit. There are people who we need to pay the rent anyway, but on a values level, like I don't know if teaching in a public university as I do, where there are like 200 plus people in an audience whom I'm inviting to have a conversation with on a twice a week, let's say, and community members are invited to join, senior scholars, we call them senior scholars, who haven't got much more to do after they've walked their dog in the morning. Like this sort of thing, I think is a way of not only producing, let's say, elites, but a way of producing discourse that hopefully cascades beyond the sort of ivory tower. So from my point of view, also, like, for example, like media like this, hopefully reaches more than 10 people.
Oh, it will.
No, but even if it doesn't now, because there will be so many likes on the Instagram post of this, maybe it will traffic with. I'm just saying that we don't. I'm not an Adornian in that way. In many other ways, yes, but I'm not for like closed door, walled off sort of elite discourse in lieu of reaching out and being able to communicate. I totally agree with your point about being able to make positive change because you can actually speak to people and they understand what you're saying.
Yeah, and hopefully you can understand what they're saying, right? It's a two-way street. I think that's a big piece of it, too.
That's a great way to spin that, and I think it's a great way to end this segment. I thanks everybody for coming. It was really a nice discussion. Got a little weird, conspiratorial, which we like. So we'll be back in about 20 minutes. Thanks for joining us here in the Conspiracy Room. This is Erik Ghenoiu, our host, Michael Osman, and Mariana Mogilevich. Thanks for joining us.